Hello and welcome to another episode of Break the Silence podcast, brought to you by Aid to the Church in Need UK, a charity supporting persecuted and other suffering Christians around the world. My name's Daniel Beurthe. I am the Public and Parliamentary Affairs Officer here at ACN UK. In this episode, I speak to Sir Stephen Timms, MP, Minister of State in the Department of Work and Pensions, who's been the MP for East Ham since 1994. We recorded this episode at Portcullis House in the Parliamentary Estates in Westminster at the end of May, just after the election was announced and just prior to Labour's landslide victory. Without further ado, let's head over to Sir Stephen Timms. Stephen, how's it going?
Well, we just had a general election declared, so my plans for the next few weeks have all been torn up and I've got to work out what I'm going to do, but I'm very pleased to have the chance to talk to you.
Brilliant, and thanks so much for joining us today. Today of all days when it must be very hectic. What's the mood in Parliament like at the moment?
Well, I think everyone is quite shocked. Nobody expected we were going to have an election on the 4th of July. We all sort of assumed that it was going to be October or November. I think probably it's a good thing that it is happening rather earlier than it was expected, because otherwise the next few months would have been very much taken up with speculation about exactly when the date of the election was going to be. And I think it is time that the next period of the country's history is determined. And I don't think very much would have been gained for anybody by waiting for a few more months, including probably the Prime Minister. So I think it probably is a good thing. But it nevertheless has come as a shock, and we've got to kind of work out exactly what we're going to do and commitments that are going to be cancelled and so on to accommodate it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you must have a very busy few weeks ahead. I just wanted to start by getting a bit of background about yourself. You've had a very long and distinguished career within UK politics. So if you could tell our listeners a bit more about that'd be great.
Well, I've been the MP for East Ham for 30 years this year. I was elected in June 1994. And before that, for 10 years, I was a member of Newham Council, the last 4 of those as leader of the council. So I grew up in Hampshire. I was born in Oldham in Lancashire, but grew up most of my childhood in Hampshire. Became a Christian as a teenager, went off to university, and one summer it was decided that our Christian Union group would go and help out on a mission in Forest Gate in East London. And we did that for 2 weeks, and I'd never been anywhere like the East End before. I remember thinking it was all a bit kind of dangerous, and I wasn't sure what I was letting myself in for, but we had a fabulous couple of weeks. I really enjoyed it. And so when I then left university, I got a job in London working in a computer company. I needed somewhere in London to live, and I didn't know anywhere except for this place where I'd helped out on that mission. So I rented a room in the home of one of the people who'd been involved with the mission, moved to Newham, joined the church, which by then had been set up by the team that had run that mission, and also decided, as I'd always been a supporter of the Labour Party, that I would join the Labour Party. This seemed to me an opportunity. But I hadn't done any politics at all at university, but I thought I'd join. And very quickly, I was asked to be a local branch secretary and then a constituency secretary, and after a few years to stand for the council. So I was elected to Newham Council in a by-election in June 1984. Became the chair of the planning committee, became the leader of the council. And then towards the end of my 4-year term as leader of the council, the previous MP, a man called Ron Layton, very sadly had a heart attack and died, and I was chosen to be his successor. So I was elected just in time to have 3 years before the Labour election victory in 1997. It was a very memorable moment for me. A year after that, I became a minister, so I served 12 years as a minister in the Labour governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, including a year in the Cabinet as Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Sadly, we were all kicked out in 2010, and since then I've been a shadow spokesperson, then involved in select committees. The last 4 years I've been chair of the Work and Pensions Select Committee. One other thing I just perhaps mention is that the last 12 years I've been chairing, I was the first chair of and still chair the all-party parliamentary group on faith and society, looking at the role of churches and other faith groups in Britain today. That's been quite important work, and I'm hoping that after the election we'll be able to continue with some of the progress that we've made in that group and getting the government to recognise more fully the importance of the part that faith groups play in Britain in the 2020s.
Okay, excellent. I mean, I just want to circle back to something that you mentioned just a moment ago. You mentioned that you became a Christian as a teenager. What encouraged that, that conversion? What led you to Christianity?
Well, I joined a thing called Farnborough Crusaders, which was a Bible class which met in Farnborough, not where I lived, but where I went to school every Sunday morning. And they came to my school to advertise themselves. And actually, I think it was my younger brother who decided first of all he was going to go along. And I sort of felt, oh, well, if he goes, I better go as well. So we both went on every Sunday. My parents supported us, helped us. They took us there and so on. Although I think we cycled on our own quite a lot of the time. But that it was there that I first heard the Christian faith properly explained. And after a while, on one of the camps we went on, I think, decided that I wanted to be a Christian myself. Okay,
excellent. And what role would you say faith has played in your career as a parliamentarian, as a politician?
Well, my thinking about politics is very much tied up with my thinking about faith, and that's really because of that history that I've set out. That I went to East London, and I felt that I was doing that with a calling, based on my experience in that mission that I'd taken part in. And having moved there and joined the church at the same sort of time, I joined the Labour Party. So that was a time when I was making lots of decisions about how I was going to spend my life, and my faith commitment and political commitment are very much kind of intertwined in my thinking. I remember when I first joined the Labour Party, and we are talking now about 1978, I was worried what people would think about a holy Joe like me turning up and getting involved. But actually, what became clear fairly quickly was that there were lots of people of faith in the party at that time. There were lots of Muslims, there were lots of Hindus, there were lots of Sikhs, and there were Christians as well. All distinct, different faiths. But I think people of faith were more comfortable dealing with another person of faith, albeit a different faith to them, rather than dealing with somebody with no faith at all. So I think that the fact that I was a Christian was actually, completely unexpectedly, a rather helpful thing in building relationships with new members with members of this party that I had newly joined. And then engaging with the community. Quite a lot of that, when I became a councillor, was working with faith groups on one thing or another. And so, there definitely was not any sort of hindrance, as it turned out. And I think also, there was a bit of a sense. So the time when I joined the party was in a fair amount of turmoil. We were in a bit of a state, very unlike our current position, of course. But I think people in the party did generally take the view, well, at least this guy is probably going to be reasonably trustworthy. And people weren't so sure that was the case with some of the other ideological commitments that were swirling around at the time. So that was also not unhelpful.
Okay, so I suppose throughout that period, then, from when you first started going out there and working, with the community, as part of the Labour Party, how has the landscape changed? How has the faith landscape, both I guess within the Labour Party and within the community, how's that changed? How have you seen that progress and develop?
I think we are much clearer today about the value and importance of the contribution that faith groups make to our community than we were then. So, I mean, I've told the story several times about what happened in the pandemic, that Good Friday, after the first lockdown had started, I was sitting at home looking through some emails, and there were 2 emails from constituents saying to me, I haven't got enough food for this bank holiday weekend, what shall I do? And I had no idea what to say to them. I'm very familiar with referring people to food banks these days, but I thought they'd probably be shut over the Easter bank holiday weekend, so I wasn't sure how to answer. However, going back further in my inbox, there was an email in there from the elected mayor of Newham, whose name is Roxana Fiaz, who does today the job that I did as leader of the council a long time ago. And she said, if you come across people over this bank holiday weekend who haven't got enough food, if you send an email to the vicar of Ascension Church in the Royal Docks before 10 in the morning, he'll make sure a food parcel is delivered by 6 p.m. the same evening.
Oh, wow.
Now, that struck me as a bit implausible, to be honest. But I didn't have any better ideas, so I gave it a try, and sure enough, both my constituents got their food parcels later on that evening. And I was very surprised about all that, because when I was the leader of Newham Council in 1990 to 94, I mean, we were polite to the churches, but we certainly didn't sort of have partnerships with them. And what the mayor's email indicated to me was that the council had decided that in this very, very difficult time, it needed to have a very deep partnership with the churches and other faith groups, the mosques as well. But it was the churches that did the lion's share in our community. And the council set up a thing called the Newham Food Partnership, which was all about the council supporting faith groups in providing food to people in the lockdown who otherwise wouldn't have had it. Families with no recourse to public funds, for example, who had absolutely no other means of getting the necessities for survival without the help that they were provided. So I mentioned earlier that I chair the all-party parliamentary group on faith and society. Looking at that experience that I'd had and others that had similar experiences, we did some research. We commissioned some research from Goldsmiths, University of London. They sent a questionnaire to every single local authority in the UK and Northern Ireland about working with faith groups during the pandemic. And it was clear that what I'd seen in Newham was happening everywhere. That, when it came to the crunch in the pandemic, where could councils go for the wherewithal in their community to help people who were in otherwise pretty dire straits? The answer was the churches and the faith groups.
Right.
And so I think as a result of that experience, there is a much clearer understanding in local government and also in national government now, and in my party as well as others, about the importance of the contribution that faith groups make. And, I think what we learned in the pandemic was if you're looking for the resources to change things for the better in communities in Britain in the 2020s, you should look to the churches.
Absolutely, Stephen. And I think that's something that we obviously see domestically, like you've just explained, but also abroad as well in other countries. So ACN is primarily focused on foreign affairs, so supporting the persecuted and suffering church in the countries where it's facing the greatest threats, the greatest degree of persecution and oppression. And often in these places, the church is all people have. In these places, a lot of NGOs, they've all left. So Médecins Sans Frontières or organisations like that, the Red Cross, they've all left because these areas are so dangerous. There's such a extreme threat of militant violence, and even local governments, they've all left. So the church really is the only organisation left to support the people there. So what with that in mind, then, what's been your kind of experience, dealing with this issue, with faith issues abroad as well as in the kind of domestic landscape?
Well, I've paid a number of visits overseas with Tear Fund. I'm an ambassador for Tear Fund, and I've visited Tanzania, for example, visited Kenya, and neither of those countries, or at least the places that I visited, they weren't places where violence had displaced everybody else. But it was nevertheless clear to me from those visits how crucial the church was to what was going on, to giving people the basics of life and the prospects of a decent future as well. So those, I was very struck by that lesson from those visits. I've supported a number of projects that internationally that reflect that. And actually, when we started the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Faith and Society, we had a series of meetings with faith groups doing really valuable things in their communities in the UK, and then we had one looking at overseas groups as well. And I think you make a very important point, and I hope again there is a better understanding today of just how important the contribution of churches overseas is than would have been the case 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, on that point, what can be done to raise awareness around that issue, around the role of faith in in civic life, both domestically and abroad? A lot of people, maybe tangentially or vaguely aware of these issues, or some of the threats facing freedom of religion or belief around the world. But what can be done to make them more aware of the severity of the situation?
I think quite a lot has been done recently. I very much welcome the work of organisations like yours, like Open Doors, Christian Solidarity Worldwide. I hosted the launch of the World Watch List from Open Doors in Parliament 2 or 3 years ago, and always look with great interest at their ranking of the countries where the problems seem to be the greatest. And I think that's all helped raise the profile and raise awareness of these problems. I think the report which Jeremy Hunt, as Foreign Secretary, commissioned from the then Bishop of Truro. The subsequent publication of that report, I think, was a very welcome step. The appointment of the Prime Minister's envoy for freedom of religion and belief, the work that Fiona Bruce has done in that role, I think all of that has been very helpful. And as you would imagine, I'm hoping for a change of government on the 4th of July, but I am very much wanting to see that work maintained and continued. And I have had a discussion with the Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, about this, and I know that's his hope as well. So hopefully the improvement that we've seen will be maintained and built on. I think there's more that needs to be done.
I think that's really interesting. Have you encountered in these these conversations that you've had both recently and over the years, have you ever encountered any opposition to this to this issue?
Not really.
Obstacles?
Not really. I mean, what I have observed and what became very good. So when we set up the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Faith and Society, as I say, we started out with a series of meetings with groups, faith-based groups or faith organisations themselves, who were dealing with a variety of issues. So the first meeting we had was about supporting unemployed people into work. The second meeting was about supporting health and well-being. And the third one, I think, was about overseas efforts, as I've mentioned. But in those first two, it became very clear very quickly that faith groups and faith-based organisations working on those important priorities in their community very often had a difficult relationship with the local authority in their area. And I think what's happened is that local authorities are very, very cautious about working with faith groups because they worry. Well, first of all, it seems really complicated to local authority officers that, if you talk to this group over here, is that going to offend this other group over here? And it's easier just not to get involved at all.
Sure.
And I think they fear that if they do, for example, if they commission a service from a faith group, then one of two things will go wrong. Either the faith group will use the funding to just try and convert people, instead of delivering that service whatever it's supposed to be. Or if they do deliver a service, it'll be biased in favour of members of that group at the expense of others. Now, as far as I can tell, and there's been a little bit of research into this, as far as I can tell, neither of those things ever happens. But there's a lot of anxiety about those things and kind of worry. And I think for that reason, local councils and probably national government as well has been very cautious about getting involved. And I hope we can get over that, both with, I think in the pandemic we did get over it with local councils, and the local councils discovered actually working with faith groups was a very, very positive experience, to the astonishment of quite a few, I think. I'm wanting that lesson to be learned for the future, but I think central government needs to learn it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of then the, just the kind of very big picture, the kind of macro view on the whole situation, what is your outlook on the state of freedom of religion or belief in the world today? Is it something that you see as improving, or is there,
Well, I think looking around the world, the problems seem to be getting worse. I mean, one of the things that really shocked me in recent issues of the World Watch List from Open Doors is that India is in the top 10 worst countries for religious persecution. What's happening to Muslims, what's happening to Christians in India is pretty shocking.
Right.
The world's biggest democracy. You kind of think that the Christians will be able to worship freely there, and yet there have been terrible incidents of violence and persecution, and the authorities apparently turning a blind eye. Yeah. That wouldn't have been the case 10 or 20 years ago. Your organisation has drawn attention to terrible things happening to churches in quite a number of parts of the world. So, yeah, the problems seem to be getting worse. Yeah. I think our response to it, the government's response to it, has improved, but we haven't done enough yet, by any means, to put the worsening profile into a better direction.
Yeah, and this is something that we at Aid Church News have seen as well. These kind of growing levels of violence, greater frequency of violent attacks with religious motivations behind them. On a personal level, this is also something I believe you have had some personal experience with, violence related to a religious issue.
Well, I'm not sure it was related to a religious issue, but you're right. I was stabbed in my constituency surgery in May 2010, just after the general election. Actually, it was the first surgery I was doing in my constituency after the 2010 general election. And a young woman who'd grown up in my constituency made an appointment to come and see me. Mm-hmm. She said she wanted to talk about an employment matter. Mm-hmm. She was a student at the time at King's College London, doing an English degree, and she was, I think, doing pretty well and was heading to be a teacher. But it turned out she didn't want to talk about an employment matter with me. She brought two knives with her, a big one and a small one. At the last minute, she decided she couldn't hide the big one up her sleeve, so she used the small one and stabbed me 3 times. And that, I mean, you know, having happened, she then sat down quietly and waited for the police to attend, as they fairly quickly did. And she said she'd done it because I had supported, as indeed I had, military action in Iraq several years previously.
Okay, interesting. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. So you say that there was no kind of religious dimension to that. Was there? So there was no kind of extremist or fundamentalist underpinnings behind that.
Well, I mean, I think she was a Muslim young woman from a Bangladeshi family. She had, I think, been radicalized online by the preaching of Mr. al-Awlaki, who was subsequently killed in a US drone strike. And so, yes, I mean, I think she did see what she was doing as her religious duty.
Right.
Worth saying, I've had a number of letters from her since then, just over the last few years. In fact, one quite recently, in which she's told me how sorry she is about what happened. And I'm hoping that there may be the chance to meet her. At the moment, that doesn't seem to be happening. It did look at one stage as though it would. But, you know, she was sentenced to prison with a minimum term of 15 years. Next year it will be 15 years. And very likely, I think that she will be freed, having completed her minimum term.
And has that event? How has that influenced your your kind of outlook, or your work in that area? You were talking a lot before about kind of community outreach. Has that had an influence or an impact on your work in that regard?
I don't think it's had a very big impact. No, I mean, you know, when I went back to my constituency surgery 6 weeks later or whatever it was, I did feel a bit nervous the first time I went there. But in the 14 years since then, there have been nothing further untoward that's happened. So it quickly got back into the swing of things. The police they were very, very helpful. And they attended my surgery for a while afterwards. They did offer me the use of a knife arch, so that people coming in to see me would go through a knife arch on the way, just to check out they weren't carrying any weapons with them. But I thought that would make the experience of going to see your MP so unpleasant that it wasn't worth doing. So I thanked them, but I didn't take them up on that offer. We've rearranged the way we do the surgery a little bit, but I hope that my constituents find me as accessible now as they did before. And I do think politicians being accessible to members of Parliament, being accessible to the people they represent, is a really, really important feature of democracy. And it's very important to me that we don't lose that or weaken it. And you know, some responses to what happened to me could have weakened those, and you know, that's not how I want to be an MP. So,
I mean, I think that's amazing. 6 weeks after that happened, and you were back meeting constituents. I think that's a great testament.
Well, they were all very nice. I mean, the response to what happened to me from my constituents was extremely kind of generous. I was inundated with cards and messages. Interesting, lots of messages from Muslims saying we're praying for you for a speedy recovery, which I was really grateful for, and from Christians as well, saying the same thing. And you know, in the end, that overall experience kind of left me, I think, with a more positive relationship with my Muslim and Christian and other constituents, and that's something that's been maintained in the time since.
Wow, that's amazing. I think that's a very very encouraging and very hopeful note to wrap up on before we.
There's one further on that point. So when I told you that I became the MP when the previous MP had a heart attack and died. question was who was going to be the candidate. The first person who came to see me to say that I should go for the job, I was leader of Newham Council at the time, was the chair of the Alliance of Newham Muslim Associations. Okay. And he said to me, you believe in God, we believe in God, we think you should go for this job. And that support was crucial for me becoming the Member of Parliament in the first place. So that relationship's always been an important one.
I think that's excellent. I think, Stephen, before we finish then, if you can leave our listeners with one message around how to foster and promote religious tolerance, both domestically and abroad, something that they can go out and do, what would that be?
I think people should contact their own MP about this. Make it clear to their Member of Parliament how important it is to them that the British government upholds freedom of religion and belief around the world. Yeah. And I think they'll find their MP is very responsive to people. Quite often worry that that MPs are very busy people, they don't want to trouble them. But MPs really welcome contacts of that kind from constituents. And I think people contacting their MP along those lines, they're parliamentary candidates, and the action that's ahead will find a positive response, and I think that will help to do a lot of good.
Brilliant, Stephen. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us today.